So these carbs are leaking right where the fuel line comes into the fuel rail. Let's get them off and get it fixed. Welcome to Urban Monk TV. So what happened here? It's a classic case of, hindsight is 20/20, and if it's not broken, don't fix it. Well, it wasn't broken 3 years ago when I last rode this bike. I didn't have a fuel leak. And the parts for this fuel rail are not easy to get. And they are notorious for leaking if you mess with them. If you take them apart and put the same parts back in there, they leak, is the word on the street, so to speak. And so I was trying to avoid that, saying to myself, I didn't have a leak when I took it apart. I don't want to mess with it because everybody says it's going to leak, so I didn't mess with it. Well, it leaked not messing with it. So we'll fix it. Let me get them off the bike. This is why I use dish soap in here to put these on, is because they slide in really easy, but they release well also. So if you think you're going to have your carbs on and off a lot, dish soap's a good idea, I think. And then I like to just partially pull the whole bank of carbs out so that I can start working on disconnecting cables that way. To me, that's easier. They're out. Now the next thing we want to do is get organized. Anytime you're taking carbs apart, don't start with a mess like this. I gotta get this cleaned up. So before I pull this whole bank apart here, take note of how I can identify each carburetor. Carburetors 2 and 4 have this atmospheric pressure line, I'll call it, which allows that you don't create a vacuum in your bowls. So those are the only two carbs that have that. Clearly number 2 cannot be mistaken for number 4 because the fuel line is open on this side of number 2 and it's closed on this side of 4. And what else? Then number 3 has the fuel petcock vacuum nipple on it, and number 1 doesn't have any of that stuff. So, or you could take a marker maybe and put 1, 2, 3, 4 where nobody's going to see it. That's another option. So here's an interesting observation here. When these carbs were sitting on the bench for the past 3 years, this T would pivot extremely easily. I mean, it just flopped around in there. Now that I've run fuel into it, it's stiff and almost stuck. So this is kind of an interesting, by the way, forgive the wind noise. The Santa Ana winds are just ripping through here today in Southern California. And there's fires up in West Hollywood, Brentwood, Beverly Hills-ish kind of area, and a lot of really nice homes are being threatened by fire. But climate change, fun. So, and I don't mean to be callous about that. I know someone who lost her home in the Malibu fires, and it's tragic. It's absolutely a terrible thing, and we gotta get a handle on this climate change thing. But that's an aside. Forgive the wind noise. This is interesting in that you really should, as a mechanic, be kind of playing around with parts and just fiddle with everything. And over time you develop a tactile feel for torque on a screw or a bolt, for resistance between two surfaces, for interferences, for rubber O-rings first being dried and constricted, but now they appear to be swelled up a bit maybe, and there's a resistance that wasn't there before. And had I never fiddled with that in the first place, I wouldn't have picked up on it. It's a trait that I think a good mechanic should have, is this desire to fiddle with everything, if that makes sense. So if this is now stiff again, maybe time has worked in my favor here and essentially stopped the leak, because we've now lubricated those O-rings and they've swelled up. I'm just going to bench test the whole thing again and just put fuel into it and see if we're leaking. Maybe the leak was caused by this. I don't think so, but first I'm going to test without it, then we'll go from there. So with the carb set up on a clean paper towel and the fuel reservoir hooked up, I'm going to pour some fuel in here, and the clean paper towel should show us a leak, if there is one, pretty quick. Okay, pouring in the gas. Oh, got a nice leak over here. What the heck? Lovely. That's why we've got lots of towels around. And a fire extinguisher. Alright, fail on this thing. No smoking, kids. I don't think any gas got down. Well, yeah, it did. No, it didn't. It leaked down the hose. Alright, anything you're seeing here is from meniscus holding it down the hose. Science ain't pretty. I'm going about this a different way now. I'm going to just use this fuel filter as a small reservoir. I think the residual I'm seeing there right now was from the meniscus holding the fuel from my previous attempt, down the outside of the hose, all over everything. It's not leaking right now. I'm going to put more fuel in. It's possible that the fuel leak I saw before in my previous episode where I started the bike was not a leak here, but actually a leak at my fuel reservoir, sliding all the way down the hose, on the outside of the hose, and then on the outside of this filter and down all over this area. I frankly didn't notice at the time. I'm still dry here. Got residual from spills that I've done, but not seeing anything caused by a leak yet. Now we got Santa Ana winds and lawn care noise. At some point here, I'm going to be overfilling these bowls. But the floats should shut it off. I just want to make sure I'm not pressurizing with my squeezing here. So I'm being slow and gentle about it. At some point I should see fuel just staying in here. Like that. So that tells me that now my floats have risen and are closing my float needle valves, because my bowls are full and I've got fuel up this T and all the way through the rail up to here. So I'm just going to put in a little bit more without pressure. Oh, there I just spilled it out the outside, so I could mistake that for a leak. Okay, so what's going on now? We have a tiny reservoir of fuel that's filled up to here, so there is a downward pressure, slight, but it's there, onto that junction. And we are not leaking. Now I'm going to observe this over time, maybe 10-15 minutes. I'm going to come back and see if this has dropped and if I'm seeing a drip or any sort of collection of fuel there at that union. Well, it's 10 minutes later. Again, forgive the background noise. And I'm still not leaking here. My level dropped a little bit, but that might just be things settling in, you know, air pockets from the bowls slowly working their way out. You know, 10 minutes, I'll come back in. This is still damp over here, but I don't think that's a leak. I think that's from all my spilling. I'm going to give it another 10 and see what we have. And another 10 minutes later, the level has dropped here yet again, but I am still dry everywhere along this fuel rail, and the paper towel's dry. I guess what you're seeing here is mainly shadows and some other stuff. This is old fuel that I had the drains open here, so that's not a leak. It's not even damp. So after 20 minutes of sitting here, I now do not have a fuel leak. I'm going to go ahead and put these back on the bike and get going with assembling the fuel tank and tuning these carbs. So what are the lessons learned here? One, this thing, I'm going to throw it away. I'm being cheap, and I'm a big enough man to admit when I've made a mistake, and I can change. So there's a life lesson. And maybe another lesson would be to bench test for leaks your carb bank before you assemble the whole bike. Though in this case that probably wouldn't have made a difference, because I believe this thing was the problem, and you know, it wasn't that difficult to take them on and off anyways. I mean, once you've made a cafe racer out of your bike and you're using pod filters and that kind of thing, carbs on and carbs off is pretty easy. Not a big deal. And we will continue to make our way toward getting this thing on the road. Hey, if you like what I'm doing, please give me a thumbs up. And if you would like to become an urban monk yourself, subscribe. Thanks for watching.